Chapter 17 of The Lost Parchment by Fergus Hume. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Difficulties. Kit owed a great deal to Hindle, and was never backward in admitting that the squire was his benefactor. When Mrs. Beatson first took service at the big house, the boy was at school, but she explained to her employer that she could no longer pay fees for his education. Rupert, approving of the bright, intelligent lad, thereupon arranged for the rounding off of his scholastic career, and afterwards paid for his training as an engineer. It was due to the squire that Kit occupied the excellent position he did in the exploitation and sale of motors. Also, it must be stated that young Beatson took every advantage of his opportunities, earning the esteem and approval of all with whom he came into contact. With the squire's aid and his own brains, there was every chance that Kit would succeed in life more than most. Naturally, the boy was deeply grateful to Hindle for his consistent kindness, but he also adored him as an athlete who possessed all those out-of-doors qualities which youths most admire in their seniors. It therefore distressed him greatly when his mother came with her tale of woe. Kit, loyal to the core, would not admit for one instant that his benefactor was in the wrong, especially as he knew only too well what a trying woman the squire had to deal with. As a parent, Kit always found Mrs. Beatson uncomfortable, since she invariably used her authority to force him into agreement with herself, however unreasonable her ideas might be. Like many another mother, Mrs. Beatson would not recognize that her son was grown up and had a right to have his own opinions. He was to obey her in all things and do what he was told. Kit thought otherwise, and as the views of the two clashed, there was always a certain amount of friction between them. Having regard to his mother's aggressive personality, it was extremely hard for young Beatson to obey the fifth commandment. Rupert knew the boy's difficulties in the adjustment of his filial duties, and greatly sympathized with him. Therefore, he was by no means surprised when Kit made his appearance at the big house early on Sunday afternoon. It was to be expected that Mrs. Beatson would tell her son about her dismissal, but when Hindle heard what his visitor had to say, he was surprised to hear that the woman had been so frank in her explanation. He made Kit sit down and repeat his story of the interview, then walked up and down the library much perplexed. For the boy, being the son of the woman who had been discharged, it was by no means easy to talk to him, and Rupert was so kind-hearted that it was a positive pain for him to say a word against anyone. Yet what could he say in condonation of Mrs. Beatson's extraordinary behavior? Kit saw the worried look on his hero's face, and felt worried himself in consequence. Therefore did he try to smooth matters. "Of course, sir, I know that my mother is rather unreasonable," he remarked in a low voice, twisting and turning his straw hat. "I don't quite agree with her views, you know." Rupert gave the boy an approving glance, as he quite understood how unpleasant was his position. "Your mother has had much trouble in her life, and perhaps her nature is rather warped. What would you like me to do?" Kit reflected, then spoke up straightly, with a flush on his face. "I think it would be better for you to allow Mother to go away for a holiday instead of dismissing her all at once. While she is away, she can give you notice and look for another place. In this way her pride will be saved." "Why should her pride be saved?" asked the squire hastily and bluntly. "How can I answer that question, Mr. Hindle?" "Of course not. I beg your pardon, Kit. I should not have asked it. What you say is very reasonable, and I have every wish to make things easy for your mother. She shall take a holiday and can leave when she has found a better place." Kit shook his young head. "She'll never find a better place, sir, or a better friend," he said sadly. "You have been good to her, and more than good to me. I wish Mother could see things as I see them, but—" "There, there!" Rupert clapped him on the back. "I know how you feel and what you wish to say. Even if your mother does leave me, Kit, that need make no difference to our friendship." "It certainly will not," said the young fellow emphatically. "I don't think Mother has acted well, nor does Sophie." "Your mother certainly was very explicit, Kit. I wonder she did not make out a better case for herself." "Well, you see, Mr. Hindle, Mother never thinks that she does wrong. It is a very difficult thing for me to say, since I am her son, but I quite understand why you want her to go. I suggest that she should take a holiday, and that she should give you notice on the plea of finding another place, both to save her pride and to shut people's mouths." "You think they will gossip, that your mother will talk?" "I don't think that Mother will talk, Mr. Hindle. She is much too frightened to do so, as she knows that she has not acted well. Sophie and I told her so, and gradually she came to see that she had made a mistake. But if you send her away, people will ask the reason." Rupert nodded and, straddling on the hearth rug, put his hands behind his back. "And I can't give any reason other than the true one." "It is impossible to give that, since it involves danger to other people." "I am glad that you persuaded your mother to hold her tongue, Kit, and it is a great relief for me to know that you and Miss Tollard are acting so discreetly. We want to help you, sir." "I don't see how either of you can do that, Kit." "Why not? We know the story of—" "From your mother's point of view you know the story," interrupted the squire hastily. "But she does not know all. There is a will which may disinherit you, I suppose, Mr. Hindle?" "Oh, yes, the will of John Hindle, leaving everything to the elder branch of the family, represented by Mr. Mallon. I intend to take it to my lawyers tomorrow after I have seen my cousin." "Why not surrender the property to your cousin, sir, without taking the will to the lawyers?" questioned Kit shrewdly. Rupert shook his head. "I wish everything to be done openly." "But seeing what is involved, Mr. Hindle, isn't there some danger of a scandal if any public statement is made?" "There is. All the same, if I gave up the property and sneaked away, people would talk, and the truth might come out in a crooked way. I wish it to come out in a straight way, and so intend to act as I say." "Will you lose everything, sir?" "I think so, if the will is proved to be legal. Then, Kit, I shall have to come to ask you to get me a situation in that factory of yours." The boy was greatly distressed. "Oh, Mr. Hindle, don't talk like that. It is wicked to think that a kind-hearted man like you should lose your property." "I don't think Mr. Mallon will make such a good use of the money." "That is his affair, Kit," replied Hindle with a sigh. "But you may be sure that I shall do all I can do to keep the property. There is a certain statute of limitations which may help me. Perhaps Mr. Mallon and I can arrange to divide the money. But what is the use of talking?" Rupert threw himself despondently into a chair. "You can't help me." "Not so far as regards the property, Mr. Hindle," said Kit earnestly, "but I may be able to help you to clear up the mystery of the murder." Rupert sat up and stared. "What?" "Oh, I don't say that I know anything for certain, sir, but I have my suspicions, you know." "Oh, have you? Who is it you suspect?" "I shall tell you when you relate to me all details unknown to my mother." Hindle rose again restlessly, and walking up and down, thought deeply. When he paused again before Kit, he made up his mind to be frank. "I know you are my friend," he said earnestly, "and I know that you are honest and true." "I am all that," rejoined Beatson emphatically, "especially when there is anything to be done for you, sir. I shall never forget your kindness to me." "Anything you say will go no further than Sophie." "Why Sophie?" asked Rupert suspiciously. "Because she knows so much that she may as well know all, and her suspicions point in the direction that mine do. She is now with Miss Mallon." Rupert uttered an ejaculation. "Not reporting the conversation with your mother, I hope," he said hastily. "Yes," answered Kit bluntly. "It is better for Sophie to speak to Miss Mallon than to Mr. Mallon." Do you suspect my cousin?" "No, but Sophie will explain when she brings Miss Mallon here. We arranged to meet here shortly, Mr. Hindle," and Kit glanced at his watch. "I dare say the two ladies will be here in an hour." "I didn't want Miss Mallon to know anything," said Hindle, frowning. "It is absolutely necessary that she should know," said Beatson calmly. "And as she loves you, sir, and is going to marry you, she should know all. I'm always in the habit of telling Sophie my troubles, and she gives me the best of advice. Every woman is not so unreasonable as my mother, Mr. Hindle." Anxious as he was, Rupert could not help smiling. "I trust not," he said at length, and sat down quietly. "Well, Kit, you are more shrewd than I gave you credit for being. Perhaps you can help me after all. Let us take advantage of the hour before the ladies arrive to go into the matter. You must be quite frank with me, sir, you know." "That is only fair. Yes, I shall be quite frank. Take a cigarette, Kit, and listen carefully to what I have to say." Shortly Rupert had his pipe, and Kit a cigarette. The door and windows being closed, Hindle felt quite secure, as it was unlikely that Mrs. Beatson would indulge in eavesdropping again, seeing what a severe lesson she had received. Hindle related slowly all that had happened, and supplied details missing in the story of Mrs. Beatson. He ended with a short sketch of his present position, and the difficulty he found in deciding what action to take. Kit was so interested in what was said that he allowed his cigarette to go out, and when the story was ended, stared tongue-tied at the squire. Rupert laughed at the expression on the boy's face. "You seemed as perplexed as I am," he remarked with a shrug. "I don't think that I am perplexed," said Kit slowly and relighting his cigarette. "Only I am astonished that you have not spotted the right man who murdered the vicar." "Things are too muddled for me to spot anyone," replied Hindle dryly. "My cousin accuses me. Mr. Carrington accuses your mother." "It is ridiculous for you or my mother to be accused," said Kit quietly. "My mother hasn't the pluck to kill a fly, in spite of her tempers, and you—" Kit laughed. "What bosh! I'd as soon believe Sophie was guilty." "Well, only your mother and I and my cousin knew about the will before." "Mr. Carrington knew?" "Oh, yes, but he was in town on the night Lee was killed, so—" "He was not in town," interrupted Kit sharply. "He was in Barship." Hindle dropped his pipe and stared. "Are you sure of what you are saying?" "You can ask Dr. Tollard if you doubt me." "Dr. Tollard?" echoed Hindle, much surprised. "What does he know?" "He came down on the evening when the vicar was murdered, and saw Mr. Carrington both on the Liverpool Street platform and on the Barship platform." "Did he speak to him?" "No. He told Sophie that Mr. Carrington had come down, but that he had traveled in another carriage. After all," went on Beatson thoughtfully, "there was no reason why the doctor should speak. He had only seen Mr. Carrington once when he called on him to get a cure for his toothache. "Yes, I remember he went to see the doctor when he first came," replied Rupert mechanically. "I was in the church with Miss Mullen, and Carrington, on his way back to the big house, looked in about his tooth on Tollard." He paused, then continued. "What train was it?" "The one which leaves Liverpool Street at 8. "That arrives here at 9:15, said Hindle, meditatively. "Yes, and as the vicar was murdered at 11, Mr. Carrington had plenty of time to make his plans." "I can't believe that Carrington is the assassin," muttered Hindle, in dismay, for he dreaded lest he should prove the accusation to be true. "Did Dr. Tollard connect Carrington with the murder?" "No. If he had, he would have spoken out. He took little notice of Mr. Carrington, thinking he was coming down on a visit to you. And as Mr. Carrington was with you the next day, of course the doctor believed that that was as he had thought." "Yes, I see. But Carrington did not come on that night. He came by the midday train next day." "The doctor didn't know that," said Kit, nodding. "In fact, he thought no more about the matter after he told Sophie, and he only told her as a piece of gossip, you understand." "Yes, yes, I see that. As Carrington was with me the next day, his presence in the 8 o'clock train on the previous night would arouse no suspicion in Tollard's mind. Still, his being at Barship that night doesn't mean that he killed the vicar." "Well," said Kit, with a wisdom beyond his years, "I rather think that it is very good evidence against him. You had told him about the will, and he knew what it meant to you. What he said when you kicked him out the other day shows he wants a large sum of money. He intended perhaps to stun the vicar and get the will, so as to make his terms with you, but the vicar, having heart disease, died straightway. For that reason Mr. Carrington buried the will and sent an anonymous letter to my mother." "But Mr. Carrington did not know where the sundial was. How, then, could he find it in the night time, hidden as it was among the bushes?" "Oh, I can't explain everything," said Beatson frankly. "But you must admit, sir, that it is odd Mr. Carrington should have been in Barship on the night of the murder without saying a word to you. If his intentions had been innocent, he would have come for the night to you." "True enough, Kit. I wonder where he spent the night." Kit shrugged his shoulders. "You will have to ask him that. I really believe that he is the guilty person." "But what about that opal in the matrix which belongs to my cousin? It was found by me on the verge of the hole where the will was buried." "Did you find it?" "Well, no. It was Carrington who pointed it out, glittering among the grasses. I merely picked it up." "Well," said Kit with a judicial air, "the person who loses generally manages to find. How do you know that Mr. Carrington didn't drop the opal there when your back was turned?" "You were very rapidly weaving a rope for the man's neck," observed Hindle dryly. "After all, we are taking a great deal for granted." "Well, sir, all you have to do is ask Mr. Carrington to explain." "Humph! That will be awkward, considering we are declared enemies. However, we shall see. I think it will be best to speak to my cousin first." Kit agreed with this suggestion and then held his tongue. He had said all that he could say, and having placed the squire on his guard, there was nothing more to be done. Rupert himself did not pursue the conversation further, but walked up and down, musing over what he had heard. For quite 5 minutes there was silence, and then Dorinda made her appearance, followed by Miss Tollard. The girl looked very pale and anxious. "What does all this mean, Rupert?" she asked nervously. "All what?" Sophie has told me a strange story, said Dorinda, taking a seat, and I suppose Kit has told it to you also. Hindle nodded. Yes, I know that Carrington was in Barship on the night when Lee was murdered, unless, of course, Dr. Tollard has made a mistake. My father made no mistake, struck in Sophie, flushing, for she had guessed that the squire was hinting at the doctor's infirmity. He was quite sober when he came home on that night. I was waiting up for him. He mentioned in quite a casual way that Mr. Carrington had traveled down by the same train, and neither of us thought anything more about the matter. Even when we heard the next morning about the murder, we thought that Mr. Carrington had come down to see you, Squire, and he certainly was with you the next day. He was, admitted Rupert quietly, and his being with me made you believe that what you thought was true. Is it not so? In a way, but the real truth is that neither my father nor myself thought anything at all about the matter. Only Mrs. Beetson's hint that Mr. Carrington might possibly be guilty made me remember. Do you think that the man is guilty? Asked Rupert quickly. Sophie bent her dark brows in a frown and reflected. I couldn't go into a witness box and swear that he committed the murder, she observed, but he came down to Barship on that night, and if he did not stay with you, Mr. Hindle, he must have had some strong reason to keep his visit a secret. Your father can swear to this visit? Yes, I asked him again if he remembered Mr. Carrington coming down, and he said that he could. Of course, added Sophie significantly, I had to ask the question in a way not likely to arouse my father's suspicions as to why it was asked. It is no use letting him know too much, as he might talk, but if necessary he can prove what he told me. Dorinda shivered. I never liked Mr. Carrington, she observed. All the same, I can't believe that he murdered Mr. Lee. Someone must have murdered him, said Kit, a trifle dryly. And why not Mr. Carrington, rather than your father, or the squire? For my part, going by what Mr. Hindle has told me, I believe Mr. Carrington is guilty. How are we going to prove him to be guilty? Well, said Rupert doubtfully, I see no way save asking him to explain why he came down to Barship on that night. Unless he gives a reasonable excuse, he will be in danger of being arrested. But, Rupert, in that case my father will be in danger. How so? Don't you know that Mr. Carrington sent for my father the other day and had an interview with him at the Hindle Arms? No. What did he wish to see your father about? He threatened to accuse him of committing the crime, so as to gain possession of the will. I don't know exactly what passed, went on Dorinda anxiously, as my father told me little. All he really said was that he was in danger of being arrested, because Mr. Carrington could give evidence against him, which would be difficult to disprove. But your father surely did not admit that he was guilty, Dorinda. Certainly not, cried the girl, flushing indignantly. How can you suggest such a thing? But as Mr. Carrington wants money, he is ready to say anything or do anything likely to force my father into paying him to hold his tongue. Rupert smiled grimly. Carrington knows that your father has not sufficient money to pay him what he wants. What does he want? Asked Sophie, looking up. £5,000 was the price he demanded from me, said Hindle, and I don't think he'll take a penny less from Mr. Mullen. But in order to get the money, Carrington will have to wait until my cousin is in possession of my property. Until then, you can be sure, Dorinda, that he will take no steps to make things uncomfortable. No, I think you are right, murmured Miss Mullen, greatly relieved. But what is best to be done? I have already made up my mind. In the first place, I shall see your father and learn exactly what took place at this interview. Afterwards, we can have a talk with Carrington. Then he will—" "Oh, let the will alone until we learn the truth about this murder," urged Dorinda anxiously. "To clear my father from all chance of being accused is the first thing to be done." "See my father, Rupert. Perhaps he will be more frank with you than he was with me." "He must be frank if he wants to save himself," said Sophie bluntly. "Don't worry, Dorinda. My opinion is that we should give Mr. Carrington plenty of rope with which to hang himself. When he is fully committed, then we can turn the tables on him by saying what we know of his presence in Barship on the night of the murder. There's nothing to be afraid of." "I'm not exactly afraid," said Dorinda slowly, "but the suspense is very trying, with Mr. Carrington working in the dark." "We'll force him to come out into the open, Miss Mallon," said Kit resolutely. "Then he will have to defend himself and won't have time to accuse other people. He shan't have everything his own way, anyhow." "Hear, hear!" cried Sophie, clapping her hands. "You're a brick, Kit. For my part, I believe that Mr. Carrington has only to be faced boldly to bring him to his knees." Rupert shook his head. "He can do some damage before he is forced to take up that position." "What does it matter so long as the damage won't be lasting?" said Dorinda impatiently. "I am certain that my father is innocent." "And so am I," finished Hindle with a shrug. "So there only remains Carrington as the possible criminal." "Well, we shall see. Anyhow, as he won't move until my cousin is in possession of the property, we have ample time to arrange what is best to be done. Meantime, let us keep what we know to ourselves." "But what about Mrs. Beatson?" hesitated Sophie, glancing at Kit. "Mrs. Beatson," said Rupert, grimly polite, "is going away for a holiday, and if she hears of a better situation she will not return here." "I am glad of that, Squire." And Sophie, guessing the plan which was to save the housekeeper's pride, felt greatly relieved. Little as she liked her future mother-in-law, she did not wish to see her disgraced. "And now I think Kit had better take me home." "But I have more to say," began Kit anxiously, only to be silenced by Sophie. "No, you haven't," she declared imperiously, and marched him to the door. "You have given the squire quite enough to think about." Then she sank her voice to scold. "Don't be a fool. They want to be alone." "Oh!" murmured Kit. "I see." And he submitted to be led away. End of chapter 17. Chapter 18 of The Lost Parchment by Fergus Hume. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Setting a trap. Mallon, by telling his daughter a half-truth instead of the whole truth, had made her very nervous, and although she asked for a more detailed explanation, he had refused to give it to her. Dorinda was therefore much relieved when Sophie conducted her to the big house, and hidden matters were made more plain. When in possession of facts, she quickly recognized that the position of her father was highly dangerous should Carrington speak to the police. But the girl agreed with Rupert that he would not do so until all chance of getting money for his silence had disappeared. Even if Mallon was willing, such money could not be obtained until the property passed from the squire to his cousin. So if Rupert refused to give up the same, Carrington would be forced to wait. It was not likely that he would kill the goose with the golden eggs by speaking prematurely. And there was, as Rupert pointed out to Dorinda, a grave doubt whether he would speak at all, when informed that his presence in Barship on the night of the murder was known. Hindle intended to question the barrister on this point and hear what defense he could offer, but before doing so, desired to see his cousin and enlist his aid. It was even more to Mullen's interest than to Rupert's to bring Carrington to book, and only by the cousins joining forces could they accomplish their end. And that was, to learn for certain who had murdered the vicar. It assuredly seemed as though the barrister was the guilty person, and should the crime be brought home to him, his evil scheme to acquire money by blackmail would be frustrated. Instead of accusing Mullen to the police, it was probable that Carrington would be forced to fly lest Lawson should lay hands on him. Dorinda returned home in a much more comfortable frame of mind, since Rupert thus placed matters in a better light. She was also more content because affairs were in her lover's hands. He, if anyone, would be able to make the crooked straight. One of Hindle's last injunctions to the girl was that she should say nothing to her father about her visit to the big house. He warned her not to repeat what she had heard and not to question her father in any way regarding his dealings with Carrington. Rupert arranged matters thus because he intended to call on his cousin the next day and have a complete understanding with him. Mullen, therefore, was much annoyed, and very illogically so, when his daughter no longer employed him to be plain with her. On Sunday evening and Monday morning she saw him looking gloomy and disturbed, yet made no effort to cheer him, or, as he put it, to bear his burden. Dorinda laughed outright when her father made this last remark. "Really, father, you are unreasonable," she observed, when putting on her hat to go shopping in the village. "How can I bear your burden when you won't tell me what it is?" "I have told you," growled the little man crossly. "That blackguard Carrington dares to accuse me of murdering Lee." "Well," said Dorinda lightly, "as you didn't murder him, what does it matter?" "You talk rubbish. Carrington can tell serious lies which may endanger my liberty." "What are those lies, father?" "I shan't tell you," snapped Mullen. Dorinda shrugged her shoulders and took up her son's shade. "Then how can you expect me to bear your burden, as you put it? You tell me enough to make me anxious, yet not enough to enable me to help you." "You can't help me." "In that case, there is no more to be said." This speech was so unanswerable that Mullen could find no reply and retreated to his own particular room, feeling, rather inconsequently, that he was not receiving the attention and sympathy which was his due. It never seemed to strike him that his daughter could scarcely administer to his comfort while she was ignorant of necessary information. But nothing irritates an unreasonable man more than being treated reasonably, and Mullen scowled blackly when he saw from the window Dorinda tripping lightly in the direction of the village. He was quite sorry for himself. "I did think that my own daughter had some decent feeling in her," he meditated sadly. "But she's like everyone else, selfish in the extreme. Oh, it's no wonder that I hate everyone. People think only of themselves. Now, what the dickens do you want? Hang you!" This last question he asked aloud, being still at the window. He saw Rupert open the little garden gate and walk briskly up to the door. As Dorinda had gone one way and Rupert had come another, Mullen never dreamed that there was any understanding between them, or that his daughter had departed so as to afford her lover a chance of speaking to her very egotistic parent. This had been arranged between the two on the previous day, and to carry out the scheme Hindle knocked at the door of his cousin with the will in his pocket. Before he left the cottage he was determined to force Mullen into plain speaking. Things were much too dangerous to permit any further beating about the bush. "Well, and what do you want?" said Mullen, repeating his former question as he opened the door to the visitor.
I want to see you, said Hindle very pointedly. It is time we had an explanation. About what? About this, and Rupert pulled the soiled and crumpled parchment out of his pocket. The will of John Hindle.
Oh, so you have it. And how did you get it, may I ask? You can ask in your own room, said Rupert politely. I can scarcely give you an explanation on the doorstep. Afraid of consequences to yourself, grumbled Mullen, nevertheless yielding so far as to lead the way into his sanctum. Oh, dear me, no, replied the visitor, seating himself. Afraid of consequences to you. To me? Mullen dropped into a chair before his desk. What do you mean? I think you know very well. I don't, said the man doggedly, and determined to leave all necessary explanation to his cousin. You speak in riddles. We must solve them together. Rupert spoke dryly, then thrust the will under Mullen's nose. Read that, and tell me what you think. Out of sheer contrariety, the host would have refused, but his curiosity and greed got the better of him, and he eagerly read the document to learn if indeed the Hindle property would come to him. The squire leaned back in his chair, filling his pipe and watching the various emotions expressing themselves on Mullen's face. Doubt, amazement, satisfaction, and exultation all appeared in turn, and when he had mastered the will, he looked up at Rupert with an expression of triumph. Mullen felt that he was top dog at last, and took a malicious delight in emphasizing the agreeable position. The property comes to me, he said, beaming with self-satisfaction. There isn't the least doubt about it. So I gather after reading that will, answered Rupert calmly. John Hindle certainly left everything to Eunice and her descendants. Frederick was illegally in possession of the property. And it follows that you were illegally in possession. I admit that, but of course, as the younger branch, represented by me, has been in possession of the estates for nearly 100 years, it is quite within my rights to take advantage of the statute of limitations. Oh, no, you shan't, said Mullen, rolling up the will and thrusting it into his desk. I am not going to be done out of my rights. Am I the man to try and do you out of them? Yes, you are, retorted the other unjustly, since you talk about this statute of limitations. Why should I not take advantage of the statute when I run a chance of being made a pauper, and not through my own fault? Because it isn't honest, said Mullen virtuously. You and yours have been wrongly in possession of what belongs to me. I'm going to have my own if I have to spend the last sixpence in the law courts. I thought you were honorable, Rupert, yet here you talk of putting me to a lot of expense to get my own estates. Hindle stared at the greedy heir, for such selfishness in taking advantage of an innocent person's misfortune was inconceivable to him. But he knew only too well that argument was useless. Mullen could only see things in his own way, and did not care who suffered so long as he benefited. However, he made one effort. Put yourself in my place, Mullen, he remarked mildly. Would you surrender everything without a struggle? That is not the question, retorted Mullen, evading a reply after his usual fashion. The property is mine, and I intend to have it. I shall keep the will, as it is not safe in your hands. Indeed, why not? You would benefit too much by its destruction. Rupert laughed. I could have destroyed it while it was in my possession and without your knowing anything about it. Instead of doing so, I have brought it to you. Does that look like dishonesty on my part? You bring it to me because you are aware that I know all about it, said Mullen, doggedly. Mrs. Beatson told me about the will, as you know. If she hadn't, you would have thrown it into the fire." "Oh, would I? Well," Rupert shrugged his big shoulders, "you are such a misanthrope that you can believe no good of your fellow creatures, so have it your own way." "How can I believe any good when everyone is so selfish?" said this amazing man. "Even Dorinda leaves me to bear my troubles alone. I wanted her to comfort me this morning, and she went out shopping." "How could she comfort you when you refused to explain things to her?" "What things?" demanded Malin, alertly and frowning. "How do you know that I have anything to explain?" "I know more than you think," replied Hindle dryly. "I know that you told her how Carrington was threatening you and—" "Hold on! Yet refused to supply details. How then can you expect her to sympathize with you and help you when there is not perfect confidence between you?" Malin did not answer directly, as he was too surprised by his cousin's mention of the barrister. "Who told you that Carrington threatened me?" "Dorinda told me yesterday, and for that reason I arranged that she should go out this morning and allow me to have an uninterrupted conversation with you." "Now don't lose your temper, Malin. I am here to have an explanation, and I don't leave this place until I get it." "I shall make no explanation," shouted the other savagely. "And Dorinda had no right to tell you about my private affairs." "She told me very little, as she knows very little." "I don't care how much she knows or how much she doesn't know," raged the angry little man, shaking with wrath. "I shan't have you meddle in my affairs." "Will you prefer Lawson to meddle instead of me?" "Lawson won't dare," answered Malin, but in a more subdued tone. "Oh, yes, he will, when Carrington tells him what he knows." "Carrington knows nothing." "He does. If he didn't, he would scarcely have had that interview with you at the Hindle Arms after I kicked him out." "You kicked him out, did you?" "Yes, I did, because he wanted me to bribe him into holding his tongue about the will. Failing getting the money from me, he attempted to get it from you at that interview. Dorinda told me that you had one, since you informed her about Carrington's threats." "Come now, Malin, the time has come for plain speaking if you wish to keep your liberty. Did Carrington ask you for £5,000? That was the sum he asked from me." Malin was forced to give in, and did so sullenly. "He did ask for that sum." Rupert nodded. "I thought so. And what did you say?" "I didn't say anything. I have taken a week to think matters over." "I see," Rupert pondered. "And at the end of the week, if you don't agree to give Carrington £5,000 when you get the property, he will tell Lawson that you murdered Lee." "He says he will, but how can he prove it?" sneered the other uneasily. "Well, you see, you lost the opal in the matrix, which I found on the verge of the hole where the will had been buried." "What does that prove?" "That you were in the grounds of the vicarage on that night." "I might have lost it on another occasion," argued Malin desperately. Rupert smiled dryly. "I don't think Lawson will be of that opinion. Come now, don't you think it is best for us to join forces and crush Carrington? For Dorinda's sake, I don't want you to get into trouble." "If we join forces, what will you ask for your services?" demanded Malin suspiciously. "That I should surrender my claim to the property, I suppose." "I ask nothing. What do you take me for?" Rupert looked highly indignant. "Do you think that everyone is so sordid as you are, Malin? We can fight out the question of the will on its own merits, but for Dorinda's sake, I wish to save you from Carrington's machinations. It is little use your getting the property if you are in danger of arrest." "I am not." "You are. Carrington is aware that Mrs. Beatson told you about the will.
He was with me when we found the opal. He says that you are guilty, and when in London sent that anonymous letter. But I forgot. You don't know about the letter." "Yes, I do," snarled Malin, wiping the perspiration from his forehead. "Carrington was very explicit at the interview." He paused for a moment, then continued. "I may as well tell you everything, since you know so much. But I warn you, Rupert, that nothing you can say or do to crush Carrington and help me will prevent my claiming the property." Hindle waved his hand lightly. "That's all right. I am aware that you are a thoroughly ungrateful man. Let that pass." "I am not ungrateful," cried Malin hotly. "What have I to be grateful for?" "In the first place, for many sums of money I have given you. In the second, for my offer to save your liberty and perhaps your life." "Were it only for your sake, Malin," added Rupert with scorn, "I should leave you to Carrington's tender mercies. As it is, I must consider Dorinda. Now, no more talk, if you please. Let me know exactly what took place between you and that blackmailing thief." Malin did not argue further. Not that he felt any shame, but he saw that Rupert was too strong for him, and he felt that his cousin had right on his side.
Malin would never have admitted the right, as his nature was too ungracious to ascribe honor to anyone but himself. In a sulky manner, and as if Rupert was trying to do him harm instead of good, he related what had passed between himself and the barrister at the Hindle Arms. The squire thus learned for the first time that Malin had been in the vicarage grounds on the night of the murder, and had lost the opal ornament during the struggle with the unknown man in the avenue. "And I believe that the fellow was you," protested Malin earnestly. "You had every right to murder Lee." "Every right?" echoed Rupert angrily. "I mean every reason," said Malin, correcting himself hurriedly. "And after the man ran away, I went to look in through the vicarage windows. There was a light in the study, and, as you know, the window had neither curtains nor blinds. I saw Lee lying dead on the floor, and went home without saying a word, lest I should be accused." "You acted the part of a brave man, I must say," said Rupert contemptuously. "But it appears that you didn't murder Lee." "No, I certainly did not. Why, I only left the cottage as the church clock chimed 11, and as Lee was murdered at that hour, he must have been dead before I reached the vicarage. I expect the man was hunting for the will, and only managed to escape with it when I ran up against him in the avenue." "But who was he?" "I don't suppose Mrs. Beatson dressed herself as a man to—" "No, no, that is ridiculous. Mrs. Beatson was made a catspaw by the same man to get the will without throwing suspicions on him." "I didn't write that anonymous letter, if that is what you mean," said Malin tartly and uneasily. "I am aware of that. It was Carrington who—" "Carrington?" Malin started to his feet. "Impossible. He was in town on the night of the murder." "He was in Barsham, and he was the man you ran across in the avenue," said Rupert grimly. "No wonder he pointed out your opal on the verge of the hole wherein the will had been buried. He dropped it there while my back was turned and allowed me to find it, so as to incriminate you." Malin was thunderstruck. "Carrington!" he muttered, sitting down again. "Oh, it is impossible." "Not at all. Dr. Tollard came down with Carrington in the train which arrives at Barsham shortly after 9. He wasn't with him, you understand, but he saw him both at the Liverpool station and at Barsham." "Then why didn't Tollard say so at the inquest?" "Why should he? Tollard never connected Carrington with the crime. He believed that he came down to see me, and as Carrington was with me the next day, of course that gave color to Tollard's belief. However, he mentioned the matter to Sophie, and she told me and Dorinda. For that reason, Dorinda came to see me yesterday, and we arranged that I should see you. Now you can understand, Malin, that we must join forces to have Carrington arrested. I have not the least doubt but what he murdered Lee to get the will and extort money for it, either from you or from me." "The scoundrel!" cried Malin, highly indignant. "And to think that he should have dared to accuse me! Me! Me!" "I was in equal danger of being accused," observed Rupert coolly. "Oh, I don't care about you," retorted the other selfishly. "I must look to myself. I shall see Lawson and have Carrington arrested." "If you do, you are sure to make a mess of things," warned Hindle, accepting his cousin's egotism with a shrug. "We must lay a trap for Carrington and get him down here. Otherwise he may escape, and then matters concerning the murder will never be cleared up." "What sort of a trap?" "You must write to Carrington asking him to come down here, to the big house, for an interview with yourself and with me. Say that you and I wish to adjust the rights of the property. Carrington knows that you cannot give him his pound of flesh until we are agreed about the will. Also, he will never suspect that he was seen in Barship on the night of the murder, or that we have put two and two together regarding the opal. He will come down." "Will he enter the big house seeing that you have kicked him out?" asked the host doubtfully. "Oh, Carrington has no shame where his own interests are concerned, Malin," replied the squire quietly. "He wants money, and is prepared to go to any lengths to get money. Let us get him to ourselves and force him to confess. Meanwhile, we will send Kit to Tarhaven for Lawson, and when the inspector arrives we can have Carrington arrested. Do you understand?" "Yes," said Malin in a rather subdued tone, for Rupert dominated him at the moment. "I shall write as you suggest, and you may be sure that I shall so word my letter as to trap the beast." "What a scoundrel!" cried Malin in a state of virtuous anger. "To try and accuse me of a crime which he has committed himself." "He looks after number one, as other people do, Malin." "Self, self! Everyone is eaten up with self, Rupert. No wonder I hate the human race. When I get the money, I shan't give anyone a single penny." "Oh, I am aware of that," rejoined Hindle contemptuously, "and I shouldn't throw stones at other people if I were you, seeing in what a glass house you live yourself, Malin. Now don't argue, but do what I tell you. If you don't, I shall wash my hands of the whole affair, and leave you to extricate yourself as best you can." Malin grunted an assent and scowled as Rupert left the cottage. He was not in the least grateful for the help thus afforded, as he hated the idea of his cousin doing anything for him. Besides, being extraordinarily vain, Malin never liked anyone to be sharper than himself. And Rupert proved to be sharper, as he had so cleverly solved the mystery of the vicar's murder. "You think you are a fine fellow, don't you?" growled Malin, shaking his fist at the retreating form of his cousin. "But you won't get a penny out of me, and you shan't marry Dorinda if I can help it. I'm not going to have you crowing over me." And thus grumbling ungratefully, he retired to his room to write the letter which was to trap Carrington. Meanwhile, Rupert returned toward the big house through the village in the hope of meeting Dorinda. He came across her just near his own gates, and in a few words reported all that had taken place. The girl listened attentively, and when her lover mentioned some of Malin's selfish speeches, she looked pained. "I wonder you do anything for my father," she said sadly. "I don't do anything for him, dear. I do it for you. Besides," added Rupert with a shrug, "how can one be angry with a child, and a greedy child at that? Will you give up the property, Rupert?" "I fear I shall have to, dear. However, we can discuss that matter when this question of Carrington's guilt is settled." "Father shall do you justice, Rupert," said Dorinda determinedly. "I shall not allow him, if I possibly can prevent it, to leave you without a penny. And then—" She broke off with a shrug. "Well, it doesn't matter. As you say, we can talk of these matters later. Just now I have something to tell you, Rupert. I met old Titus Ark." "Yes?" "You know that he was Mr. Lee's shadow. Well, he tells me now that he was lurking about the vicarage on the night of the murder, and that he saw Mr. Carrington there." "The deuce! Why didn't he say so before?" Dorinda shook her head. "He refuses to say." "I shall question him myself, then," said Hindle briskly. "Anyhow, he will be a new and important witness. I am afraid Carrington's goose is cooked." "Poor creature," sighed Dorinda, always tender-hearted. "Oh, poor creature." Chapter 18. Chapter 19 of The Lost Parchment by Fergus Hume. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Resurgam. Next evening Rupert received a curt note from Malin stating that Carrington had replied to the effect that he would come down to Barship on the ensuing day, and would reach the big house at 12 o'clock. Pleased with the information, since the interview was likely to settle the question of the vicar's murder once and for all, Hindle took it upon himself to arrange matters. To compel plain speaking on the part of the slippery barrister, it was necessary that witnesses should be present for the purpose of proving beyond question his presence in Barship on the night of the crime. Without doubt, Carrington would twist and turn like an eel in his efforts to escape from the corner in which the procurable evidence would place him. Rupert, weary of mystery and worry, made up his mind that the man should be finally brought to book, and therefore went in search of Dr. Tollard. Now that Inspector Lawson was to be dragged into the matter for the purpose of arresting the culprit, there was no need for further secrecy. And besides, visiting the doctor, Hindle intended to call on Ark for his testimony. Faced by these two witnesses, it would not be easy for Carrington to win free. Mrs. Beatson duly went away for her so-called holiday, which was simply a preface to her dismissal. Her presence was not required at the coming interview, as what she knew and what she had done did not touch immediately on Carrington's guilt. Also, neither Dorinda nor Sophie was to be present, as they could give no first-hand evidence. Rupert himself, Malin, Ark, and the doctor were the necessary people to prove that Carrington had struck the blow, and the squire employed Kit to bring Lawson from Tarhaven for his share in the proceedings. And so that everything should be prepared beforehand for Lawson's action, Rupert arranged that the officer should not arrive at the big house until 1 o'clock. This would give Rupert and his friends 60 minutes to bring Carrington to bay. Tollard was both startled and surprised when the squire called to explain why his presence was required at the big house. He had thought little of Carrington's presence in the train on that fatal evening, and had not in any way connected his presence in Barship with the tragic death of Lee. This he explained to his visitor, and suggested that, after all, some mistake had been made in crediting the barrister with the commission of the crime. But Hindle, determined to put an end to all mystery, explained to Tollard all about the discovery of the will, and pointed out what a leading part the document had played in ensuing events. Tollard, who for once was sober, expressed his amazement and regret, less for the vicar's death than for Rupert's probable loss of his property. "And surely," said Tollard in his husky voice, and with his big red face expressing sympathy. "Surely Mullen will not take everything from you, even if this will proves to be legal." "Oh, the will appears to be legal enough, Doctor. And knowing my cousin as you do, you may expect him to grab everything." "He'll make a bad squire." "That's his lookout," replied Hindle with a shrug. "A bad lookout for the parish, Hindle. I don't set myself up for a saint, as I have my failings, but Mullen!" The doctor made a face. "Why, he'll ruin the place. Don't give in to him, if only for the sake of Barship. Fight him to the bitter end." "Oh, I'll protect my interests as best I can, you may be sure," answered Rupert, pleased that Tollard was on his side. "But that matter can be attended to later. What we have to do now is to force Carrington into confession. I take it that you are sure it was Carrington who came down in the same train with you, Doctor?" "Certainly. I know him well by sight, as he called on me when he first visited you to get some remedy for toothache. I never forget a face. And I saw your friend both on the Liverpool Street platform and at the Barship station." "Did Carrington try to escape observation?" "Well, I hardly know. He did not see me, so far as I know, and he had a heavy overcoat on, which was strange, considering how sultry was the evening. The collar was turned up, I remember," mused the doctor thoughtfully. "Well, yes, I think he was anxious not to be recognized. I never thought anything about the matter, you know, Hindle, as I believed he was coming down to stay with you. As he was with you the next day, my belief was natural enough." "Quite so," assented the squire, "but he must have returned on the same night to town, perhaps by the midnight express from Tarhaven. His visit to me only dated from 12 o'clock the next day, when he arrived by the midday train." And he knew about the will?" "Mrs. Beatson told him. I expect he wished to get it, to sell it to me." "Ah, he doesn't know what an honest man you are, Hindle." "He knows now," responded Rupert dryly. "However, I understand that you will come to the big house at 12 o'clock tomorrow to give evidence." "Certainly, certainly." "And—" Rupert hesitated with an awkward look. "Oh, I'll be sober," said Tollard with a defiant laugh. "I'm not quite so bad as people make out. You can depend upon my doing everything I can to help you, Hindle, as I have a great regard for you." And the burly doctor shook hands warmly with the squire. Rupert went away feeling sorry that a man with such a good heart should be a slave to a despicable vice, and wondering if there was no way in which he could be reformed. Tollard, when sober, was a clever physician, but when in his cups made endless mistakes. And for a medical man to make mistakes is dangerous, seeing that he is dealing with matters of life and death. However, much as Hindle wished to assist Tollard to lead a better life and give his undoubted abilities a chance, this was not the moment to attend to the matter, as there were more immediately important matters to be looked into. So having secured Tollard as a witness, the squire walked to Ark's abode. This was a tumble-down cottage on the verge of the churchyard, which stood in a well-kept garden, surrounded by a wall of loose stones. Here lived the old sexton and his grandson in tolerable comfort. The neat looks of the garden were due to Tobias Ark, for his grandfather took no interest in such things. Tobias himself was a lean, dark-faced man, taciturn and rather melancholy, perhaps by reason of his funeral employment. He was digging in the flower beds when the squire approached the gate, and hastened to come forward with a surly touch of his forelock. In answer to Rupert's inquiry, he admitted that his grandfather was in the cottage, and said he would send him out to hear what the squire had to say. Hindle did not mind waiting at the gate, as he had no wish to enter Ark's stuffy abode. "Whoa! It be the squaw," piped Titus when his grandson went in and he came out, like the little old man and woman in the weather gauge. "And what be you here for, squaw? There bain't be no funerals, surely." "No, Titus, no. I have come to ask you about what you said to Miss Mullen." "Ah!" Ark looked tremendously cunning, and his face wrinkled up like that of a monkey gloating over a nut. "And what might that be, squaw?" "You told her that you saw Mr. Carrington near the vicarage on the night that Mr. Lee died." "Mr. Lee bain't dead, I tell you, squaw." "Yes, yes, Titus, we know all about that," replied Rupert soothingly, for he was well aware of the fixed idea which dominated the old man. "But you saw Mr. Carrington about the house?" "Yus, I did. When walking round the vicarage, not being able to sleep, me being old beyond telling, young sir, and the night being warm like." "Yus," continued Ark garrulously, "I see him sure enough. He come down the road in the moonlight dressed as if it wert winter and went into the vicarage gardens. But Lord bless ye, squaw, I did think as he'd gone to see the vicar, and never thought aught of him being there." "But the next morning, Titus, when you heard the vicar was dead—" "He bain't dead, I tell you, squaw," persisted the ancient crossly. Evidently it was useless to try and beat sense into the old creature's head, so Rupert argued no further. Ark could evidently swear to Carrington's presence in the vicinity of the vicarage on the night in question, and that was the main point. "Well, Titus, we won't talk about the vicar being alive or dead. I want you to come tomorrow to the big house to tell Mr. Carrington that you saw him on—" "Be Mr. Carrington there tomorrow?" inquired the ancient, his eyes glittering and evidently eager. "Yes, at 12 o'clock. Can you swear that you saw him on that night?" "Before the king and the Lord Chancellor," grunted the sexton. "Aye, for sure I can say so, squaw. Oh, I'll be there, sir. I'll be there." He rubbed his old, wrinkled, snarled hands gleefully. "I'll tell you what I know, squire. We think that Mr. Carrington killed the vicar." "Mr. Lee, he bain't dead, I tell you," said Titus for the third time and very irritably, after which he shuffled back to the cottage, annoyed that his constant statement was not accepted. And it was queer that the old man should persist in declaring the vicar to be alive, seeing that he had assisted to lay him in the family vault, which was visible from his abode. However, Rupert, having impressed upon Ark that he was to be at the big house at 12 o'clock next day, did not trouble himself with the ancient's fancies. So long as Ark could swear, as he evidently could, that Carrington had been haunting the vicarage on the night of the murder, what he believed about the vicar not being dead mattered little. The man was senile and was crazy on the one point, although he appeared to be clear enough on that other concerned with Carrington's presence at the vicarage. Rupert did not trouble his head further about the matter, but returned home satisfied that the two witnesses would confound Carrington in the moment of his fancied triumph. Nothing of any moment happened during the rest of the day or the next morning, when the meeting was to take place. Kit appeared with a spick-and-span machine before midday, and was sent over by Hindle to Tarhaven to bring back the inspector by 1 o'clock. And Rupert informed the boy that while on the way back he could tell Lawson all that had been discovered, so as to obviate the necessity of explanations. In fact, as Hindle said, it would be best for Kit to relate everything immediately he arrived at the police station in Tarhaven, so that the inspector could get a warrant for the barrister's arrest. So Kit went off in high glee, delighted at being able to do something for his hero, and Rupert returned thoughtfully to his library, where Mullen was already waiting. "Suppose Carrington doesn't come?" suggested the squire, who was very nervous. Oh, he'll come right enough, explained Mullen grimly. I said in my letter that today you intended to arrange here about the transfer of the property to me under John Hindle's will, and that we both wanted him to be present. You don't suppose that he has any suspicions of the truth? Oh, to be sure he hasn't. After all, but for Tollard's evidence and that of old Ark, we should never have been able to nail him. I tell you, Rupert, that Carrington has not the least idea of what is about to happen. Poor devil! And yet he deserves his fate. The murder of Lee was cowardly in the extreme. It was, assented the other. Don't be a tender-hearted fool, man. I would rather be a fool according to my light than a wise man according to yours, Mullen. And I am quite content, chuckled the little man, for no one but a fool would give up the property as you are doing. I haven't given it up yet, said Rupert, disgusted with this brutal speech, and I may not be the fool you take me to be. For all his insolence, Mullen was plainly disconcerted by this frank statement, and began to think that he had gone too far. A muttered apology was on his lips, but was cut short by the entrance of Dr. Tollard. Immediately behind him shuffled old Ark, who seated himself near the door, chuckling and rubbing his hands with the air of a man who was highly pleased with himself. Mullen and the doctor, who were by no means friends, exchanged a curt greeting, and Tollard, turning his back on the prospective squire of Barship, talked ostentatiously to Rupert. Mr. Carrington will be here almost at once, he declared, drawing off his gloves slowly. He walked up behind Ark and myself as we reached the gates. Even as he spoke, the footman appeared to announce the barrister. Carrington, evidently considering himself master of the situation, walked in with a victorious air. He looked smart and alert, being quite in his best form, in a well-cut suit of blue serge with a straw hat and brown shoes. He had apparently arrayed himself in his best to receive the money he expected. Of course, he did not anticipate that the 5,000 would be handed to him at once, but when things were arranged between Hindle and Mullen as to the possession of the property, then Carrington intended to get a promise in writing of his share of the plunder. Not for one moment did he think that anything was wrong, and he even offered his hand to Rupert with an insolent air of pity. "Every dog has his day, Hindle," he said maliciously. "This is mine." "Don't be too sure," replied Rupert, rejecting the proffered hand. "There is many a slip between cup and lip, remember." "You are full of wisdom," sneered Carrington. "Well, you will need it all to earn money when you are a pauper." Hindle stepped forward until he towered over the smaller man and spoke slowly. "Don't tempt me to give you the thrashing which I let you off with the other day, Carrington," he muttered. "Let us get to business, and rid me of your presence as soon as possible." "Oh, I am ready to go into business as soon as you like," retorted the barrister, still triumphant. "But why is Dr. Tollard here?" "I am here," said Tollard gruffly, "to state to your face that you were in Barship on the night when Lee was murdered." Carrington started, and in spite of his self-command, winced at the plain speech. His swarthy face grew slightly pale, but he still maintained his air of bravado. "Well, then, I am not here to talk about Lee's murder," he said viciously, "but to see about this transfer of the Hindle estates to my friend Mr. Mullen." "Don't call me your friend," growled Mullen ferociously. "You are no friend of mine. All you want is to get money out of me." "Take care," said Carrington, glancing at the others. "Remember what I know." "And what do you know?" demanded Mullen coolly. "Something you would not like anyone else to hear." "You can say what you like, and before anyone you like." "Ah!" Carrington now began to see that things were not so safe as he had imagined. "You mean to go back on your bargain?" "I never made any bargain, you beast, and what is more, I don't intend to make any. Yonder is Dr. Tollard, who can swear that you came down to Barship on the night Lee was murdered, and yonder is Titus Ark, who saw you enter the vicarage grounds." "They are both liars," cried Carrington, taken off his guard. "I bain't a liar," said Ark, rising, and tottered toward the barrister. "And were I a younger man, I'd make ye pay for saying so." He shook a snarled fist in Carrington's face. "I did see you round about the vicarage. I swear to it, if needs be, before judge and jury. I bain't afeard." "And you will be required to swear before judge and jury," said Hindle in a cold, measured tone, "when Carrington is in the dock." "In the dock?" Carrington stepped back, trying to command his nerves, for he now began to understand the full extent of his peril. "And on what charge?" "You killed Lee," growled Mollin savagely. "Yes, you did, so don't deny it, you criminal, and you dare to accuse me." "I do accuse you," said Carrington, driven to bay and becoming fierce out of sheer desperation. "It was you who killed Lee to get that will. I accuse you in the presence of these witnesses." "Pshaw!" said Rupert contemptuously. "What is the use of your talking, Carrington? The game's up. We have got you down here to have you arrested." "You can't arrest me," said the barrister with an air of bravado. "I shall go at once to Tarhaven and give information against Mollin." Rupert got between the barrister and the door, toward which he was retreating swiftly. "Stop where you are," he commanded. "There will be no need for you to go to Tarhaven. In an hour Inspector Lawson will be here, and then, if you dare, you can lay an information against Mollin." "Oh!" Carrington winced and grew very white. "This is a trap." "It is," said Mollin with malignant satisfaction. "And I have lured you into it. You accuse me, do you? Ha! We'll see what you'll say when the handcuffs are on your wrists." "Hindle!" Carrington turned to his former friend with a cry, half of rage and half of fear. "Will you stand by and hear this said of me?" "Why should I interfere?" said Hindle stolidly. "You are only reaping as you have sown. To get money you were prepared to accuse me, as you have accused Mollin, and all the time you are the criminal, as we now know." "I am not," shouted the miserable man, trembling. "You can't prove that I did the deed." "I can prove that you came down to Barship on that night," said Tollard. "And who will take the word of a drunkard?" Tollard rushed at the barrister and would have struck him, but that Rupert pushed his big body between the two. "Don't lose your temper, Tollard. What does it matter? Carrington will have plenty to do to clear himself without calling anyone silly names. You understand," he added, turning toward the lawyer, "that Ark and the doctor can swear to your presence in Barship on the night when Lee was killed. You knew from me about the will and came down to murder the vicar." "I did not. Even if I had wanted the will, I should not have murdered him." "Pshaw!" said Rupert again, and pushing his advantage relentlessly. "All this denial will not serve you. Perhaps you may not have intended to murder the vicar when you struck the blow. I will do you that justice. But, as Lee had a weak heart, you went too far and he died. Then you took the will and buried it under the sundial." "I didn't know where the sundial was," interpolated Carrington, shivering. "That's a lie," snarled Mollin swiftly. "For on the first day I met you I took you round the garden, and among other things pointed out the sundial. You buried the will there and then sent an anonymous letter to Mrs. Beatson so that she might find it and avert suspicion from yourself. You believed that Rupert would buy your silence to keep the property,
and failing his doing so, you came to threaten me. And I do. You were at the vicarage on that night. How do you know that? Carrington saw that he had said too much and glanced toward the door in the hope of getting away. But Rupert was between him and safety, and Rupert looked as stern and determined as a destroying angel.
"You needn't think you will escape, Carrington," he said.
"As you have sown, so you must reap." "And your reaping will place a rope around your neck," said Mullen grimly. "You came to have me hanged, but you will go away under Lawson's escort to be hanged yourself. I was at the vicarage on that night. I wanted to see Lee about getting the will, but I did not leave my cottage until 11, and by that time you had murdered Lee."
I did not. And Carrington winced and cringed and shivered with all the courage oozing out of him. "You did. It was you I struggled with in the avenue when you came out, after burying the will under the sundial. You snatched at my watch chain and got the opal in the matrix." "Yes," said Rupert, taking up the story. "And when we went to examine the hole where the will was buried, you dropped the opal when my back was turned and allowed me to find it, so that the blame might be thrown on Mullen." "It's a lie," said Carrington, folding his arms and looking dogged. "And I wonder at you defending a man who is going to rob you of your property." "I dare say you do wonder," retorted the squire acidly. "Honest behavior is always a mystery to you. No wonder you followed Mrs. Beeson and induced me to do so, Carrington. You had written that anonymous letter to her and knew that she was going to find the will. Your plot was a very clever one, but it has failed completely." "And I dare swear it has failed," said Tollard in his booming voice, "because the squire is such an honest man." By this time the perspiration was streaming down Carrington's face. He was now in danger of his life, and knew it only too well. Yet the man was brave enough, and doggedly refused to admit what was said, in spite of the overwhelming evidence. Rupert had no cause to love his treacherous friend, and regretted that he was obliged to have him arrested, yet could not help admiring the persistent way in which the man fought for his liberty and life. "Who accuses me of being in Barsham on that night?" he demanded, raising his head. "A drunkard doctor and a senile sexton. Those are nice witnesses. They have been bribed by Mullen to save his own skin." "I don't waste money in unnecessary bribes," snapped Mullen. "And I don't take money for performing my duty," said the doctor, frowning. "I have one great fault which everyone knows of. I may be a drunkard, but I am not a murderer," he finished scathingly. "I am not a murderer," persisted Carrington, fighting desperately and gaining courage now that he found himself with his back to the wall. "I never came down to Barsham on that night. I can prove that I was in London." "You will have every opportunity of clearing yourself at the trial," said Rupert, glancing at his watch. "Lawson will be here soon with a warrant for your arrest." "No, no, no!" The cry was forced from the barrister against his will. "It is impossible for Lawson to arrest me. I never saw Lee on that night." Titus Ark rose in a creaky manner from his chair and shambled toward the miserable man. "I do say as you did see him," he croaked. "And so does Tollard," snapped Mullen. "That is, he can say you were in Barsham on that night. Hark, Hindle, I believe Lawson has arrived." Rupert hurried to the window and saw a vehicle pass round the corner toward the front door. "It's a trap and not a motor," he said, puzzled. "Who can it be, I wonder?" I know," said Titus, shuffling toward the door. "I know one as can say you saw Mr. Lee on that night," and he disappeared. "More lies," said Carrington, wiping his face. "Oh, I'll make you all pay dearly for this day's work," and he wiped his face while he set his teeth to battle to the end. There was a shuffling noise in the hall, and Rupert stepped toward the door. He opened it,
and then fell back with a cry of amazement. Supported by Titus and his grandson, Simon Lee staggered into the room. "I said he warn't dead," chuckled the ancient. "Now didn't I, squaw?" End of chapter 19.
Chapter 20 of The Lost Parchment by Fergus Hume. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A weird story. The unexpected appearance of a man who was supposed, and with every reason, to be dead and buried was so startling that for a few moments no one could speak. Had it been night time, those present might well have been excused had they taken the newcomer for a ghost. But a ghost would scarcely reveal itself in broad daylight, supported by two flesh-and-blood mortals. Amazing as it seemed, the one person who was placed in the convenient armchair by his guides was actually the Reverend Simon Lee. His head was bandaged, his face was bloodless, and he appeared to be listless and exhausted. Never was there such a dramatic entrance or such an uncanny situation. "Lee!" gasped Rupert, hardly able to pronounce the name. "Yes," replied the parson, faintly smiling. "I am alive, you see." "I said he warn't dead," chuckled Ark again, and rubbed his horny hands with comfortable glee, while his grandson Tobias stood mute and grim behind the man who had returned from the other world. Carrington, equally startled, was the first to recover himself entirely. He saw in the reappearance of the clergyman a chance of escape from his dangerous position. "You accuse me of murdering Lee, and Lee is alive," he said, regaining swiftly his native impudence. "What do you say now, Hindle?" Rupert turned his eyes from the vicar to Tollard, whose big face was purple with astonishment. "What do you say, doctor?" he asked feebly. "It's a dream," muttered Tollard, rubbing his eyes. "He must be dead. I examined the body. I saw him buried. I gave the certificate of death." "I'm sorry to disappoint you, Tollard," murmured Lee with a weak attempt at a smile. "But you see I am still alive. Tobias?" The grim man knew what was asked for, and producing a flask of generous proportions, administered a stiff dose of brandy to his patient. The ardent spirit made Lee cough, but brought the blood to his cheek and a more lively light into his dim eyes. Also, when he opened his mouth, he spoke with a stronger voice. "Yes, I am alive. I was buried by mistake." "It's impossible, I tell you," cried the doctor, still struggling with his astonishment. "You were as dead as a doornail." "So you thought, Tollard, but you were not the first medical man who has mistaken catalepsy for death." "Catalepsy? I have been subject to it all my life, but I never told anyone about it, not even you, Tollard. Only Titus knew, and that was why he was what was called my shadow down in the village. I always dreaded being buried alive." "Yet you were," said Rupert, staring with all his might at the resuscitated man and wondering if he was asleep or awake. Titus wasn't much good, after all, in spite of his watchfulness. "And what could I do, squaw?" demanded the ancient shrilly. "I said as Muster Lee warn't dead again and again, but none heeded me." "If you had used the one word catalepsy," protested Tollard, who was annoyed that Lee should reappear to give the lie to his skill, "I should have known what to do." "I bain't no scholard," croaked Titus sulkily. "I said as Muster Lee warn't dead, and he warn't. On the night of the day when he was buried, me and Tobias got him out of the coffin, and he have been in my house getting well."
You should have told me, Titus, expostulated Rupert reprovingly. Now the Lord help me, Squire. Didn't I tell ye times without number?
I said as Mr. Lee warn't dead, and you laughed.
You know you did. But he warn't dead. He warn't dead. And the ancient repeated his favorite phrase again and again with angry gestures. No, he warn't dead, mimicked Carrington, strolling easily toward the door. And now that we know he warn't, I suppose there is no objection to my leaving this pleasant little party. Stay where you are, commanded Lee in a much stronger voice. It is no thanks to you that I am alive. Stop him, Hindle.
Rupert took Carrington by the shoulders and pushed him across the room and into the chair he had vacated. You stay here, he said sternly. Oh, I'll stay if you wish me to, replied Carrington, making a virtue of necessity and shrugging his shoulders contemptuously. You can't get me into trouble now. We'll see about that, replied Lee, who was breathing heavily. I haven't much time to live, as the shock of being buried alive has given me my death blow. But I shall live long enough to see that justice is done. Now let me explain what I owe to Mr. Carrington. One moment before you change the subject, remarked Tollard sharply. You told me that you had heart disease. I did, admitted the vicar dryly, but I never allowed you to examine me, or you would have found that my heart was perfectly sound. I made that excuse to account for anyone finding me in a cataleptic trance. You should have told me the truth, rejoined the doctor sternly. But that I thought the blow on the head had killed you, along with heart disease, I would have opened your body to be certain of the cause of death, as it was, Mr. Lee. As it were, interrupted the old sexton aggressively. You weren't sober, Muster Tollard. That you weren't. How dare you say that? Cried the doctor, flushing angrily. Aye, but I do say it, retorted Titus valiantly. You saw double, you did, and not being sure of your larning, said as Muster Lee war dead when he warn't. And if you'd tried to cut Muster Lee up, I'd have knocked ye down. Yes, I would, and no mistake. It seems to me that we are not getting on very fast, said Carrington lightly yet anxiously, for he desired to get away before Inspector Lawson arrived from Tar Haven. Suppose Mr. Lee speaks and relates his experiences in the other world. I shall deal with you later, said Lee meaningly, and with an unpleasant look. You are not going to escape punishment because you failed to carry out your evil design. First, I shall explain about my catalepsy. I have always been afflicted thus, Hindle, he added, turning to the young squire, and for that reason I rarely went away from my house. Titus knew that I was subject to these trances, and I always liked to have him at my elbow in case I fell into one. Also, Titus had the key to my family vault, so as to rescue me should I be buried alive by any chance. The blow on the head did not kill me outright, although it was severe enough very nearly to do so. I was stunned for the time being, and then passed into a trance. Owing to the warm weather, unfortunately for me, I was buried hastily, else I might have recovered. You were as dead as any man could be, persisted Tollard sullenly, for the revival annoyed him beyond measure. I was not yet, although you, in your confused state, thought so. And you were confused with drink, Tollard, as Titus assures me. Let this be a warning to you, my friend, to abandon this vice, as you may not so easily escape again from dooming a man to a terrible death. Tollard tried to speak, but could not, as he knew very well that he was entirely in the wrong, and that the consequences of his too hurried examination of the body might be serious for him. He stammered, stuttered, and turned very white, then walked silently out of the room. He had received a lesson which he would not easily forget. Rupert started forward to stop him, but Malin, who had been too startled to speak hitherto, laid a detaining hand on his arm. The man was nervous and less aggressive than usual, which was not to be wondered at considering what had taken place. "Let him go, Rupert," he muttered. "We can deal with this matter among ourselves. I want to hear now how Mr. Lee was rescued from his terrible position." "Titus rescued me," said Lee thankfully. "On the night of the day when I was buried he came with Tobias to the vault. He had the key, as I said before, in case of such an accident. These two," he jerked his head right and left toward his supporters, "unscrewed the coffin and carried me into their house, which is, as you know, near the churchyard. Gradually I revived from my trance, but suffered greatly from the blow in the head which confused me. Feeling that I was not myself, and knowing that serious matters had to be dealt with, I ordered Titus and his grandson not to say anything about my being alive. Since the day of my burial I have been hidden in that little cottage, and Titus has nursed me back to health. But I fear," ended the vicar plaintively, "that I shall not live long. The shock has killed me." "Well, at all events," said Carrington coolly, "I didn't kill you." "Indirectly you have," said Lee indignantly, "and I shall have you punished before I die." "That is a nice Christian feeling, I must say," retorted Carrington uneasily. "Men such as you are, who go about attempting murder, should be locked up," was the stern reply. "You intended to kill me." "I did not. I intended to stun you and thought I had done so," protested Carrington sullenly. "No one was more astonished than I was when I heard next day from Hindle there that you were dead. I thought the heart disease had killed you." "I had no heart disease and—" "We all know about that," interrupted Malin restlessly. "But tell us how that scoundrel managed to knock you down." "Give me another dose of brandy, Tobias," said the vicar, and when he felt stronger, after taking the spirit, proceeded slowly to explain. "I was in my study on that night, and as it was after 10 o'clock, Mr. and Mrs. Jabber had retired to rest. I had found the will, which I had mislaid, and was reading it, when I heard a tap at the window." "I don't know about your reading it," said Carrington insolently. "As I watched you for some time through the window before I tapped, you were holding a parchment over a candle. I believe that you intended to burn the will." "Perhaps I did," said the vicar with a queer smile. "There is more to be known about that will than you guess. At all events, when I heard your tapping on the glass, I blew out the candle and put down the will. I opened the window, you know it is a French window, Hindle, and looked out to see who had come at such an untimely hour. When I recognized you, and you intimated that you wished to speak to me, I admitted you. I believed that you had come down to stay with Hindle, and had arrived late." "Did you lock the window again after admitting Carrington?" asked Rupert. "I snicked it, certainly," replied Lee quietly. "Not that doing so mattered, for, as there was nothing to steal at the vicarage, I paid little attention to bolts and bars." Carrington laughed cynically. "And for that reason I was able to slip out the front door and leave it unlocked without exciting suspicion," he remarked. "It was easy to get away." "Very easy," assented Mr. Lee. "The front door was never locked either by day or by night, as I did not fear burglars. And I did not fear you, Mr. Carrington, as you said that Rupert had told you about the will, and you wished to speak to me concerning it." "Oh, you were brave enough," retorted the barrister carelessly. "Well, I think you had better be less flippant, my man," cried Malin, highly indignant. "You are not out of the woods yet." "There's gratitude for what I have done for you," sneered Carrington. "But for my appearance at the window, the vicar might have burned the will so as to allow Hindle to keep the property." Yes, I might have burnt the will, as you say, remarked Lee with another queer smile, and perhaps it would have been as well, seeing what an excellent squire our young friend here makes. And what about me? Asked Malin indignantly. You are not fit to govern the parish, said Lee coolly. You think of self and of self only. Well, the will is safe in my desk now, said Malin complacently. And self or no self, I will be squire of Barship as soon as the lawyers can arrange for the transfer of the property. You count your chickens before they are hatched, Mr. Malin. There is much to be said before you step into your cousin's place. I don't see that, said Malin doggedly. Rupert knows that I inherit by the will you found in the monument chest, as I am the legal descendant of Eunice Hindle. He makes no objection to giving me the property. Is this so, Hindle? Inquired the vicar. Yes, answered Rupert quietly. I can scarcely keep what does not legally belong to me. You will be a pauper. I can't help that. I must act honestly. Lee was silent for a moment and cast a look of admiration on the young man. You shame us all by your honorable nature, he said after a pause. I am glad that I am spared to do you justice. What do you mean by that? Asked Carrington curiously. Never mind what I mean. I shall explain in due time. Just now I have to tell these gentlemen of the cowardly assault you made on an old man. Lee turned toward Rupert, to whom he chiefly addressed himself. He held me in talk, Hindle, and all the time he was keeping his eyes on the will. I refused to let him take it away, as he wanted to do. I only wished to look after Hindle's interest, muttered Carrington. To look after your own, you mean, retorted Lee tartly. Had you meant well, you would have gone away after I refused to give you the will. But you waited until my back was turned, and then struck me with the loaded stick you carried. The blow fell on my right temple, and I dropped stunned to the floor, while I, cried Carrington, rising and speaking insolently, snatched up the will and walked out of the front door cautiously, so as not to waken those servants of yours. After which, put in Malin viciously, you went through the jungle and buried the will under the sundial. I did, admitted Carrington recklessly. You know so much that you may as well know all. For Lee being alive, you cannot touch me in any way. I buried the will, as you say, and afterward wrote that letter to Mrs. Beatson, so that she might find the will and avert suspicion from myself. Why Mrs. Beatson? Asked Rupert, disgusted with his former friend's brazen assurance. Because, according to you, she had overheard the conversation between you and the vicar. I guessed that, if she produced the will, suspicion would fall on her. Our meeting her on that night, Hindle, was pure chance, but it helped on my plans. I wished her to procure the will to you, and thus bring suspicion on herself as having killed the vicar. You infernal villain! Oh, I don't see that, said Carrington carelessly. Mrs. Beatson would be none the worse for having her neck stretched, but I would not have allowed things to go so far as that. All I wished was for her to give you the will, and then when you consulted me, as I knew you would, I intended to persuade you to burn it in order to keep the property and pay me £5,000 for holding my tongue. You understand? Yes, said Rupert quietly. You explain your villainy so carefully that I can scarcely help understanding. It was you, then, who dropped a clue near the sundial to incriminate Malin. It was me, replied Carrington with cynical hardihood. I snatched the opal by chance from Malin's watch chain when we struggled in the avenue. Only when I got away and found what was in my hand did I see how I could get the upper hand of him. I recognized the ornament at once as the one he had shown me on the first day we met. "You scoundrel!" shrieked Mullen furiously, and would have struck the barrister, but that he swerved. Then Rupert interfered. "He will have a much worse punishment than a blow," said the squire, holding his cousin back with a strong arm. "I won't have any punishment at all," sneered Carrington insistently. "It is for me to say that," remarked Lee, who was growing very weak in spite of the dose of brandy which Tobias administered. "So you met Mr. Mullen in the avenue of my place after you had buried the will?" "I did. There is no reason why I should deny it, seeing that I am safe, and when I got away from him I walked to the next station and caught the night express from Tarhaven, which does not stop at Barship. Next day—" "You came down to play the part of a friend," said Rupert scornfully. "But you soon showed the cloven hoof, Carrington. Your plot was very clever, and had I been a less honest man it would have succeeded." "It never would have succeeded," interposed the vicar, speaking with labored breath. "For I was alive all the time and intended to speak when necessary, as I have done. Titus kept me informed of all that went on." "Aye, that I did," said the old man, patting Lee's hand. "And they'll find in the village as the old 'un don't tell lies, and bain't no fool either. I told 'em as you were alive, didn't I, Muster Lee?" "Yes, Titus, yes. But I think you will very soon have to tell them that I am dead," said Lee with a weak sigh. "After all, it is for the best. I shall never regain my health after that awful experience, and as my successor has been appointed, it would be wrong of me to deprive him of the living." "Don't trouble about that, Lee," remarked Rupert, bending over him. "You shall stay here and be nursed back into health again. I'll see that you are all right for the future." "You are a good man, Hindle, but if you knew—" He stopped abruptly and drew away his hand which the squire had taken. "But that I can speak of another time. Meanwhile, we must finish dealing with this gentleman." "Do you mean me?" asked Mullen, who felt uneasy because he had an idea that the resuscitated man had, as the saying goes, something up his sleeve. "I don't mean you at present," replied the vicar, eyeing him with an expression of intense dislike. "I shall attend to your matter later." "What matter?" "That," said Lee slowly, "I shall tell you in my own good time." "You are very mysterious." "Oh, I think all mysteries are at an end now," interposed Rupert hastily, for Mullen showed a tendency to make himself disagreeable, in spite of the vicar's weak state of health. "We now know that Carrington did come to Barship and did strike down Mr. Lee." "Who cares if you do know?" retorted Carrington insolently. "Not me. I have played a bold game and have lost, thanks to your confounded honesty. If you had been wise, you would have destroyed that will, and would have kept your money to yourself." "At the cost of losing my honor," said Rupert, flushing. "Poof! Who cares for honor in these days?" "Apparently you don't, you beast," cried Mullen, who was desperately angry at the way in which Carrington had proposed to cheat him. "How dare you speak in this way? I'll have you charged with fraud." "Fraud!" Carrington laughed aloud and snapped his fingers. "And how do you intend to do that, my good man?" "Don't call me your good man, confound you." "Well, I won't," sneered the barrister. "It is rather a mistake to credit you with any goodness, I admit. You're no more a saint than I am, and would have played the same game had you got the chance. My only regret is that I have not rooked you to the tune of £5,000, and but for the vicar's unexpected appearance, I should have done so." "Not you!" "Oh, yes. You were at the vicarage on the night of the presumed murder, and I had your opal which I dropped near the sundial. If I had held my tongue, as I would have done, You would have been hard put to explain your presence there, seeing what John Hindle's will meant to you." "And you," shouted Mullen furiously. "How would you have escaped suspicion seeing you came down on that night?" "Very easily," retorted the barrister in a light and airy tone. "I would have declared that I came down in Hindle's interest to get the will, and arrived at the vicarage to find you leaving the house after murdering the man." "Oh!" Mullen rushed forward. "Let me at him, Rupert, dog that he is. I want to strangle him." "And be hanged for the murder of a worthless creature," said Rupert, holding Mullen tightly to prevent his executing his intention. "Leave him to Mr. Lee. I rather think he knows how to deal with him." "Oh, do you?" snapped Carrington, wheeling with a contemptuous smile on his dark face. "And what do you propose to do, may I ask?" "I propose," said the vicar whom he addressed, "to have you arrested for a murderous assault on me. As a lawyer, Mr. Carrington, you probably know how many years you will get for a contemplated crime." Carrington drew pale and looked nervous. "I never intended to kill you," he muttered sullenly. "And, as you are alive and well—" "I am alive, certainly, but scarcely well," said the vicar faintly. "All the same, it is no thanks to you that I am not dead. You assaulted me and you robbed me. So you shall suffer." "I shan't," and Carrington made a dash for the door, only to be caught by the squire, who held on to him grimly. "You shall," said Rupert stolidly. "As soon as Lawson arrives, and he may be here at any minute, Lee will give you in charge for assault and robbery." "Hindle, you wouldn't see me disgraced in that way," pleaded Carrington, who suddenly saw an abyss open at his feet. "If I am arrested, I will be ruined." Hindle released the miserable man and stood back, rather incautiously as it afterward proved. "You would have ruined me," he said sternly, "so why should you not be done by as you intended to be done by others?" "There's Scripture authority for that," grunted old Ark, grinning toothlessly. Carrington, now at bay, looked round and saw that everyone was against him, so that there was no hope of mercy. He covered his face with his hands and staggered against the wall near the door. For a moment there was silence, for although neither Mullen nor Lee pitied the scoundrel, Rupert, having an unusually tender heart, did so. Perhaps the feeling that the man was his old schoolfellow induced him to give Carrington a chance of escape. But be this as it may, when the barrister, sobbing near the door, suddenly opened it and dashed out, Rupert made no immediate effort to stop him. Mullen did. "Stop thief! Stop liar! Stop murderer!" he vociferated and followed. Rupert was thus compelled to pursue the culprit, although he did so reluctantly. The two came to the door to see Carrington running down the avenue and dashed after him. The barrister flew like the wind and speedily outdistanced his pursuers. But he was not to escape after all, for, as he reached the open gates of the avenue, Kit's motor car, containing Lawson, swept round the corner. Running blindly, Carrington tripped and fell under the machine. The wheels passed over him, breaking his back. He was picked up stone dead. End of chapter 20. Chapter 21 of The Lost Parchment by Fergus Hume. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A final surprise. At the inquest held on the body of the unfortunate Carrington, the whole story of the events connected with the will of John Hindle was related in detail. This was done by the advice of Inspector Lawson, so as to avert further trouble. As the officer wisely pointed out, it was necessary that the characters of all those implicated in the affair should be cleared once and for all. This could only be done by the truth being made public, and this course of procedure greatly recommended itself to Rupert, who was tired of underhand doings. He was of a frank nature, and the idea of hiding this and concealing that annoyed him exceedingly. He therefore made a clean breast of the matter when called upon to give evidence regarding Carrington's death, and insisted that everyone else should do the same. Consequently, the whole amazing story appeared in print and read like a romance. Mollon was inclined to hold back from giving evidence, as of course he should have communicated with the police the moment he became cognizant that a murder had been committed. But both his cousin and Lawson insisted that he should come forward to state what he knew, and, notwithstanding his reluctance, he was compelled to do so. He escaped better than he deserved, as it was seen how difficult his position had been, and the majority of people argued that the man could scarcely have been expected to incriminate himself by drawing attention to the crime at the time when he discovered it. Mrs. Beatson also contrived to elude reproof, as she cleverly stated that, when in possession of the will, she had intended to hand it over to the squire. Of course, Rupert knew that she had never meant to do this, but for the sake of Kit, he did not contradict her statement. And because of Dorinda's feelings, he was glad to think that Mollon had gotten off so lightly. The two plotters themselves were much relieved that their characters had not suffered to an appreciable extent, and retired into the grateful shade of obscurity as speedily as possible. Things had turned out better than they had expected. Carrington's conduct, of course, was condemned, since he had behaved so basely, but not so severely as it would have been had he been alive. Having met with a violent death, it was felt that he paid for his trickery, and as little as possible was said about him. Kit, of course, was exonerated with regard to the accident, as Lawson proved that the young man had sounded his horn when turning into the park. But Carrington, anxious only to escape before the inspector could take him in charge, had either not heard the warning of the horn or had not attended to it. But be this as it may, there was no doubt that he had ran on blindly, and thus had fallen under the cruel wheels of the car. Remembering Carrington's two premonitions about walking over his grave in the avenue, Rupert thought it quite uncanny that he should have met his fate on the very spot. But he only remarked on the matter to Dorinda, who was wise enough to hold her tongue. Enough had been said about Carrington and his disreputable doings in the newspapers, so there was no need to say more. Mr. Lee did not appear at the inquest, as he lay dying in a comfortable bed under the hospitable roof of the big house. But he signed a written statement detailing the events of the night when he had been struck down, and this satisfied both coroner and jury. After all procurable evidence had been sifted, a verdict of death by misadventure was brought in, and the matter ended in the only way it could end. Carrington's sole relative, a clerk in the War Office, came down to take charge of the body, but expressed little surprise at the smirched reputation of the dead man. Carrington had always been a black sheep, and his relative grimly said to Rupert that he was glad things had turned out as they had. Carrington, he observed, would sooner or later have come to prison or the gallows had he lived, being one of those unfortunate creatures who could not run straight. So that was the end of the squire's old school friend, who had chosen evil instead of good. And bad as he had been, Hindle was kind-hearted enough to regret the man's miserable end. Afterward, he always tried to remember Carrington as he had been at Rugby, rather than the despicable plotter of his more mature years. With the departure of the barrister's body, in charge of his relative from Barship departed all mystery. It is now known who had struck down the vicar and why the blow had been delivered. That Lee had escaped death was not Carrington's fault, and the dead man was practically a murderer. But the villagers, in the excitement of finding their vicar alive, began to overlook Carrington's share in the matter. The question most frequently asked was whether Lee would resume his charge of the parish, seeing that his successor had been appointed. But all talk on this point was ended when it became known that the shocks inflicted on the unfortunate man, both by being struck down and by being buried alive, had so shaken his system that he was not likely to live. Tollert was attending to him, and did so in an entirely sober state, as his nearer escape from trouble kept him away from the drink. Sophie, indeed, regarded the whole matter as a blessing in disguise, and hoped that her father would reform. He had every reason to do so, seeing what a lesson he had received. With regard to his giving a certificate of death, Tollert's fellow physicians held that he was perfectly justified, since the vicar had been in a cataleptic trance. But the villagers, headed by Titus, held that Dr. Tollert had been drunk at the time when he examined the body, and this opinion was not favorable to Tollert's reputation. However, when it was seen that he had turned over a new leaf, his conduct was considered more kindly, and the doctor began to hope that he would weather the storm. But it had very nearly wrecked him, and the escape he had greatly improved his character. In time, by acting judiciously and keeping strictly sober, he managed to reestablish his position. A week later, when everything in connection with the catastrophe was quite settled, Malin made his appearance at the big house. He was more subdued than usual, as he also had learned a lesson, but there remained something of his old blustering manner when he entered the library and produced John Hendel's will from his pocket. Rupert guessed that his cousin had come to demand a settlement, and braced himself to face a disagreeable future. It was not pleasant to become a pauper, but there seemed to be nothing for it but to accept the inevitable. Yet it was not so much the loss of the money which the young man regretted, as the probable loss of Dorinda as his wife. Rupert knew his cousin well enough to be sure that once in the possession of the estates and income, he would not be inclined to permit the marriage to take place. And seeing that he was likely to be poor, it was useless for the girl to insist upon the fulfillment of the engagement. It was with a sad face and a weary heart that Hendel asked Malin to take a seat. "I suppose you have called to discuss matters regarding the will," he said, leaning his head on his hand and speaking quietly. "In a way, though I don't see that there is anything to discuss," retorted Malin, who was rapidly regaining his former bullying ways. "All you have to do is to clear out and allow me to come here." "Walk out? Bag and baggage, you mean?" "Something of that sort. I don't mind giving you £100 with which to make a new start in life. If I were you, I would go to Australia with Kit when he marries Sophie Tollert." "And what about Dorinda?" "She is not for you," said Malin resolutely. "As the daughter of the Squire of Barship, she must marry a man with a position." "Does Dorinda say so?" inquired Rupert quietly. "Dorinda," said the affectionate parent, "is as obstinate as a pig. She is coming here in a few minutes to argue the matter. I told her that I intended to settle the matter of the will today. But she shan't marry you with my consent. And as I have the money, you can see that it would be wrong of you to drag her down to poverty." "You put the case very plainly, Malin." "How else do you expect me to put it?" said the other, who was not in the least ashamed of the cowardly way in which he was behaving. "You might have a little more consideration for my position," remarked Rupert with a shrug. What consideration did you ever show to me? Snarled Malin. Rupert looked at the little man in amazement. I have always been your good friend, he said after a pause. I have given you money and— My own money, interrupted the visitor. Much thanks for that. It won't do, Rupert. I won't allow you to work on my feelings. I never knew that you had any to work on. No more I have. I want justice, and justice I intend to have. Don't make such a row over the matter, said Hindle contemptuously. You shall have what you want, but you can scarcely expect me to walk out of this house this very minute. We must take the will to the lawyers and have it gone into. Since you are behaving so brutally, I am inclined to defend my position. There is the statute of limitations to be considered. And there is me to be considered, said a quiet voice at the door, and the two turned to see Dorinda at the door. You have been listening? Snapped her father. Yes, I have, she replied boldly, and what I have heard shows me what a cruel nature you have, father. Don't speak to me in that way, stormed Malin furiously. Oh, yes, I shall. And Dorinda entered to place her hand on Rupert's shoulder as if to give him confidence. You have not got Rupert's money yet. But I shall get it. The will is plain enough. Before Dorinda could reply, Rupert rose to his feet and made a gesture that she should be silent. Lee has something to say about the will, Malin, he remarked, and had you not come over, I should have sent for you. Lee wishes to see you and me and Dorinda. If Lee intends to try on any hanky-panky, said Malin, uneasily, for the summons seemed strange and ominous to him, he'll find himself in the wrong box, I can tell you. You've been scheming with him, I expect, since he has been lying there. I have scarcely seen him, retorted Rupert, passing his arm round Dorinda's waist. Tollard says he should be kept quiet. Then we shan't disturb him now. Yes, we shall. Lee has something on his mind and wants to see the three of us. Tollard has given permission, so we can go up to him now. Only I beg of you, Malin, not to excite him, as he is very weak, and is not far from death. You understand? I understand that you want to trick me in some way. By this time, Rupert's long-enduring patience was at an end, and he turned on the selfish little man in a cold fury. Look here, Malin, I have had enough of this, he said firmly. Don't goad me too far, or you will regret it. Oh, will I? Taunted the other. And in what way? Possession is 9 points of the law, retorted Hindle, and you appear to forget that I am the squire of Barship. I shall see the lawyers and take all chances I can to prevent you getting possession of the money. I am innocent of any roguery in the matter, and my position is a very unfair one, as I am not to blame. It is close upon a century since that will was made, and if I make use of the statute of limitations, I may be able to squash the whole affair. Equity, if not common law, will be on my side. You, cried Malin violently. You swindler! Don't call me names, said Rupert imperiously, or in spite of the fact that Dorinda has the misfortune to call you father, I shall kick you out of the house. So now you know. My own house, foamed Malin, stamping. It's not your house yet, and it may never be. Well, Malin drew a long breath. I never. He turned on his daughter suddenly and with violence. What do you think of this behavior? I entirely approve of it, said Dorinda calmly, and I am glad to see Rupert stand up for his rights. He has treated you far too well as it is. What? It's no use, father. You don't care for me, and you don't care for your honor. All you do care for is yourself. I shall cut you off with a shilling. With a shilling! So long as I have Rupert, I don't care.
Hindle caught Mullen by the shoulders and pushed him toward the door. "I can't allow any more of this, Mullen. Behave like a human being or I shall turn you out. Now come up and hear what Lee has to say." "Oh, I'll come," cried Mullen viciously, but unable to resist his cousin's superior strength. "But remember that if there is any plot to take away my money, I shall make things hot for you." Get on, said Hindle impatiently, "and don't make a fool of yourself." Mullen did go on, and climbed the stairs to Lee's room unwillingly. He was beginning to see that there was nothing to be gained by storming, and that his best plan would be to adjust the matters in dispute quietly. Although he believed the will to be legal, he yet had a lurking suspicion that it might be set aside by the statute of limitations. Under these circumstances it would be unwise to quarrel with his cousin, so he became more subdued. All the same, his dog-like temper could not be entirely suppressed, and he entered the sick chamber growling and muttering savagely. Dorinda and Rupert followed, the girl crying with shame. Her father's conduct was disgraceful. The vicar was propped up in bed with pillows, looking white and weak. It was evident that he had not long to live, and there was an anxious expression on his face which showed that he had something on his mind. With a faint smile he welcomed the newcomers and signed to the nurse that she should leave the room. This the woman did, whispering in passing Rupert that Tollard had left instructions that the patient was to be as little excited as possible, since his strength was rapidly failing. She also gave the young squire a strong stimulant with which to revive Lee, should he grow faint during the interview, and saying that she would return in half an hour, departed softly. When the door was closed, the vicar looked at the weeping Dorinda and her scowling father, also at Rupert, who was cool and composed. Inwardly the squire was greatly disturbed, but it was necessary that he should keep his emotions under control, and he did so. "Why do you cry, Dorinda?" asked the vicar, softly. "She's a fool," growled Mullen, frowning blackly. "I am an honest girl," said Dorinda, flushing and drying her eyes, "and I am ashamed of the cowardly way in which you are behaving." "How is your father behaving?" questioned Lee with an ironic smile. "He wants to take everything from Rupert and make him a pauper," said Dorinda sadly. "He refuses to allow me to marry him." "And will you obey him?" "No," she drew herself up proudly. "I love Rupert more than myself, and if he will marry me I am ready to be his wife at any moment." "Fool, fool!" growled her father savagely. "What do you say, Hindle?" inquired the vicar calmly. "I wish to marry Dorinda, as I love her dearly," answered the squire, who was pale but composed. "But if this will is proved to be legal, I may lose all, and I can't ask Dorinda to share a life of poverty with me." "I don't care for your poverty," cried the girl impetuously, throwing her arms round her lover's neck. "I would rather have a crust with you than stay with my father in luxury." "But I don't think it would be necessary for you to be reduced to a crust, Dorinda," smiled the vicar. "After all, considering the circumstances of the case, and that Hindle is not to blame, surely your father will give you half the income." £2,000, said Mullen derisively. "I'm not such a fool. I shan't give Rupert a single penny, and if Dorinda marries him without my consent, which she will never get, she must be prepared to starve." "Dorinda will never starve while I can work," said Rupert calmly. "What at? You have never done a hand's turn in your life." Lee interposed before Rupert could reply. "Mullen, surely you will not behave so wickedly and selfishly as to keep all the money to yourself." "Yes, I shall. The money is mine, and I shall not give a penny." "You are a bad man," said Lee slowly.
Pooh! What do I care for your names? Nothing. I can see that. However, I may be able to make you care. Dorinda, give me some of that tonic." The vicar's voice was growing weak and his eyes closed. Dorinda slipped her arm round his neck and gave him a dose of the medicine, which shortly took effect. He opened his eyes again and spoke in a stronger voice. "Are you determined to behave in this unjust way, Malin?" "It is not unjust, and I do." "You will keep all the money to yourself?" "Every penny." "And, if you can, prevent Dorinda marrying Hindle?" "Yes. She does so at the risk of starvation." "But you may ruin 2 lives, Malin." "Pooh! Don't talk rubbish, Vicar. I shall do as I like." "You shall not do as you like," said Lee steadily. "You are an evil and wicked man, although I am too sinful myself to say so. But I thank God that He has permitted me to live and make reparation for my wrongdoing." The vicar fumbled under his pillow and produced an envelope. "Take this, Hindle, and put it into your pocket. No, don't open it now. When I am dead you can learn how deeply I have sinned. And above all, don't let Malin get hold of it." Rupert slipped the envelope into the pocket of his coat and smiled grimly, although he also looked astonished. "I'll take care of that," he said with a nod. "But what is the paper about?" "It contains a signed and witnessed confession of my sin." "Your sin?" Malin began to shake in his shoes, as there was something very ominous about these proceedings. "Yes, I intended evil, and evil has come of my intention. But thank God I am able to nip my wrongdoing in the bud." "Malin," the vicar shook a reproving forefinger at the man, "I have given you every chance to behave as a Christian should, but you will not seize the opportunity. Now it is too late, and you must abide by your selfish conduct." "What the devil are you talking about?" "Hush, Father, hush! Don't speak like that," cried Dorinda with a shiver. "I shall speak as I like. What does Lee mean by his nonsense?" "You will not find that paper I have given Hindle nonsense," said Lee in a faint voice. "It contains an account of my sin, and will be your punishment." "Come to the point, come to the point," stuttered Malin, nervously angry. Lee turned to look at Hindle, who stood beside Dorinda, silently amazed at all this strange talk. "My friend," he said, wincing at having to lower himself in the young man's eyes, "I was tempted by Satan, and I fell. In the monument chest I found a bundle of letters written by John Hindle, which showed that he wished to disinherit his son Frederick, whom he hated, in favor of Eunice, the infant daughter of his eldest son, Walter, whom he loved. He declared in the last letter of the bundle, which you will find in the chest where I left it, that he would make a will, leaving the estates to Eunice, who married Filbert when she grew up. But John Hindle died of heart disease, as other family documents show, before he could execute his intention. He made no will in favor of Eunice, and Frederick lawfully inherited the property." Malin turned a greenish color and pulled out the will from the pocket, the will which had caused so many disasters. "John Hindle made this?" "He did not," interrupted the vicar in a strong and triumphant voice. "I made that will. It is forged." "Forged!" Rupert, Dorinda, and Malin all echoed the word. "Yes," Lee went on, speaking swiftly as if fearful that his strength would not hold out to the end. "I wanted money to go to Yucatan, and hoped to get it from Hindle. He was not inclined to fit out an expedition, so I hoped to force him. Satan entered into me, and taking advantage of what was in those letters of John Hindle, I prepared the will in favor of Eunice. I bought the parchment and wrote out what was wanted to give me a hold over Hindle. When Carrington saw me holding the will over the candle, I was doing so to change the color of the ink and make the parchment appear black and a little contracted. I did not give the forged will to Hindle when I spoke about it, as it was not quite ready. Next day I proposed to give it to him, and to offer to allow him to burn it on condition that he gave me enough money to go to Yucatan with an expedition. Failing Rupert, I should have gone to you, Mr. Mullen." "And you would have gone," gasped Rupert, amazed by this recital. "I would never have agreed to suppress that will had I believed it, as I did, to be genuine." "I see that now," said Lee, whose voice was becoming fainter. "You were too honorable for Mullen and Carrington, and you would have been too honorable for me. My forgery was vain. But God intervened and prevented me from carrying out my wicked plot. Carrington came and you know the rest. I acted wickedly, and I " He stopped and fell back on his pillows with a ghastly look on his face. "He is dying," cried Dorinda, running to the bedside. "Call the nurse." Rupert opened the door, but Mullen, looking like a fiend, rushed to the dying man and shook him roughly. "You are a liar! You are a liar!" he screamed, white with thwarted ambition. "This will is not forged. This will is—" Hindle, furious with the man's inhumanity, caught him by the shoulders and thrust him out of the room. The nurse hurried in and along with Dorinda tried to revive the fainting vicar, but in vain. Dr. Tollett was immediately sent for and came at once to pronounce that there was no hope. Lee lingered for 24 hours and then passed away quietly without ever regaining consciousness. This time, as Tollett took care to prove, the vicar was really dead, and within a week his body was again placed in the family vault. To be certain about the catalepsy, the corpse was kept above ground for the 7 days until there was no doubt that the man actually was dead. In vain Titus Ark, overcome with grief, repeated his parrot cry that his friend warn't dead. Lee was on this occasion a truly dead man. The blow on the head, the shock to his nervous system caused by being buried alive, and perhaps the shame of having to confess his forgery of the will, had all combined to kill him. He died, and Barship knew him no more. And Mullen? He was almost crazy with rage at his loss. Again and again he tried to prove that the forged will was a genuine document, and saw many lawyers and experts. But the confession of Lee, signed by himself and witnessed by Titus Ark and his grandson, held good, as it gave all details of how the false testament had been prepared. Lee confessed therein that he had copied the signature of John Hindle from the letters which first gave him an idea of committing the forgery. So in the end Mullen had to accept the fact that Rupert was the true squire of Barship, and that there was not the slightest chance of his getting a single penny of the 4,000 a year he so greedily coveted. While Mullen, frenzied with baffled avarice, was moving heaven and earth to prove that he was the rightful heir, the other people who had been connected with the strange affair of the will were settling themselves in life. Mrs. Beatson obtained a situation as housekeeper to an invalid gentleman in Derbyshire, much to the relief of Kit and Miss Tollett. Hindle was so pleased with the way in which these two had assisted him at an awkward moment that he gave Kit a handsome sum of money, and along with Dorinda was present at his marriage to the doctor's daughter. Tollett himself found that, in spite of all efforts, he could not quite do away with the prejudice against him, although more or less he managed, as has been said, to reestablish his position. But perhaps conscience had something to do with his determination to go to Australia with the young couple, for he felt very uncomfortable among his patients. Sophie, who was unwilling to part from her father since he might take to drink again, suggested that he should emigrate. The doctor did so and shortly departed with Mr. and Mrs. Beatson for Melbourne, where he hoped to redeem himself entirely. And thanks to Rupert's generosity, a start at the Antipodes was made easy both for him and for the young people. As to Hindle and Dorinda, they took advantage of Mollen's preoccupation with regard to the will to get married quietly in London. Dorinda was of age and did not require her father's consent. Moreover, after his shabby behavior, she felt that even though he was her father, she could never live with him again. So she became Mrs. Hindle shortly after Lee was buried for the second time, and, after a short honeymoon, returned to be welcomed by one and all as the mistress of the big house. Everyone was delighted that Rupert still kept his position, and everyone knew that the will, which had caused so much trouble, had been forged. Hindle would have preferred to keep Lee's confession to himself out of regard to the unfortunate vicar's memory, but Mollen's action left him no option but to make it public. The amazing story added yet another chapter to the romance of the whole queer business, and the story got into the newspapers. Mr. and Mrs. Hindle were not a little troubled by reporters and interviewers and snapshot people, but in the end curiosity died away and they were left to live their own simple life, doing good and making everyone around them happy. In the end, Mollen found that his efforts to prove the will to be genuine were futile, so one day presented himself at the big house in a very dismal frame of mind. Not being able to get the property, he was secretly pleased that his daughter should have become Mrs. Hindle, even without his consent, as he had hoped to use her for his own ends. With the greatest impudence, he suggested that his son-in-law should fulfill his old promise and allow him $500 a year. "Oh, no," said Rupert calmly when Mollen came for a last interview. "I don't think it's good for you to be treated with such leniency." "Nor do I," chimed in Dorinda, who found it difficult to behave amiably to her father, seeing how badly he had behaved. "What do you mean?" demanded Mollen, taken aback, for he had quite expected to get his own way. "What do you both mean?" "I don't think it is so very difficult to gather what we mean," replied Rupert coolly. "You never intended to give me a penny had you got the money, so why should I give an income to you? That's different." "Maybe. Anyhow, you will have to live on what you have." "I am Dorinda's father." "I don't look on you as my father," said the undutiful daughter. "You never have behaved like a father to me, and now that I have Rupert to look after me, I wish to see as little of you as possible." "And this is my child," moaned Mollen, much cast down. Dorinda laughed. "It won't do, father," she said calmly. "As Mr. Lee declared on his deathbed, you had every opportunity of acting honorably. How you have acted I leave to your conscience to say." "I won't," said Rupert sharply. "See here, Mollen, I am a kind-hearted man and wish to help everyone, but for me to give you money for your wickedness would be wrong." "What wickedness?" "If you will have it, you threatened to turn me out of this house as a pauper, and you have done your best to prove true a document which you knew to be forged. If you had triumphed, Dorinda and I would have been thrown into the street without a penny. Because you have failed, you come whimpering to me for money. You shan't have any. As you are my wife's father, I should have allowed you enough to live on had you been without an income. But as you enjoy $500 a year of your own, you can exist on that. And, as people here are not very well disposed toward you, I advise you to go away." Furious at this plain speaking, Mollen turned on his daughter. "Do you hear now how I'm spoken to?" he demanded, looking black. "I hear," responded Mrs. Hindle quietly, "and I am glad that you hear the truth for once in your life. I hope it will make you a better man. I think you had better take Rupert's advice and leave Barship." "Oh, I shall go. I don't want to stay in such a hole," shouted Mullen, putting on his hat violently. Then he became pathetic. "And I go to live a lonely life." "I think you will find plenty of amusement in playing with your jewels," said Dorinda quietly. "You never cared for me." Mullen, muttering something about an ungrateful child and a serpent's tooth, walked away with a drooping head. It dawned on him dimly when he shook the dust of Barship from his feet that perhaps after all, as he had not given affection, he could not expect affection. But his egotism was much too strong to permit him to understand fully that he was only reaping what he had sown. He took up his abode in London and managed to get along very comfortably on his $500 a year. But he always persisted in regarding himself as a much injured man and stubbornly maintained that the will forged by leave was genuine. Needless to say, he never missed his daughter, as he was far too much wrapped up in himself to desire any company but his own. "Do you think we acted rightly, Rupert?" asked Dorinda in a troubled tone when her father departed after that last interview. "Yes, dear. He is your father, certainly, but he has no right to take advantage of the relationship to behave so selfishly as he has done. It would be wrong to pander to his egotism by giving him money." "Yes, I suppose so," said Dorinda with a sigh. "People are very hard to understand, Rupert. Besides my father, who puzzled me with his selfishness, there is Mr. Lee. Whatever made such a good and kind man forge that will?" Rupert shrugged his shoulders. "A sudden temptation, perhaps," he said after a pause. "But I don't pretend to explain. His act was entirely opposed to his character. If he was in a story, people would say he was inconsistent." Dorinda agreed. "Very inconsistent. Human beings are strange." "They are, dear. But you see, as we only see the outside of people, we don't know how to account for every action. The majority of people are children and often act wrongly without thinking of the consequences. After all, evil is only ignorance. For if wrongdoers knew what they would have to pay for behaving wickedly, they would not sin. Now, darling, don't think anything more about the matter. Let us enjoy the peace which has come to us after the storm. There is no more to be said about the past and no more to be done. We are happy and try to make others happy. What more do you want?" "This," said Dorinda, and kissed him fondly. End of chapter 21. Recording by Sharon Kilmer, San Antonio, Texas. End of The Lost Parchment by Fergus Hume.